You think getting a parking ticket is bad? In medieval times, they had punishment so creative and brutal that modern horror movies look like Disney cartoons. Picture this: it's a sunny Tuesday morning in 1347, and you're walking through the town square when suddenly you see a crowd gathering around what looks like a wooden contraption that seems designed by someone who clearly had way too much time on their hands and a serious grudge against humanity. The smell hits you first: unwashed bodies, rotting food, and something else you can't quite identify but definitely don't want to. Welcome to medieval justice, where punishment wasn't just about making you pay for your crimes, it was about entertaining the entire neighborhood while doing it. Today, we're diving into the darkest corner of human creativity, where lawmakers and executioners competed to see who could come up with the most absurd, humiliating, and downright insane ways to make criminals regret their life choices. We're talking about punishments so outrageous that they make modern prison systems look like luxury resorts. From devices that would make Jigsaw from the Saw movies take notes, to public humiliations that would traumatize entire generations, medieval folks really said hold my ale when it came to creative justice. So buckle up, because we're about to explore how our ancestors turned punishment into an art form, a very, very disturbing art form that somehow lasted for centuries and makes you wonder how humanity managed to evolve past this madness. Imagine living in a time where stealing a loaf of bread could result in you being the main attraction at the town's weekly entertainment event, except instead of applause, you're getting rotten vegetables thrown at your face while locked in a wooden cage that's specifically designed to make you as uncomfortable as humanly possible. This wasn't some rare occurrence, this was Tuesday. Medieval people had a completely different relationship with justice than we do today. While we debate about rehabilitation versus punishment, they were busy inventing contraptions that would make medieval torture museums seem like playgrounds. The wild part is that many of these punishments were considered merciful alternatives to execution, which really puts things into perspective about what medieval folks considered a light sentence. We're not just talking about your run-of-the-mill dungeon imprisonment here, we're talking about a systematic approach to making people suffer in the most creative, public, and psychologically damaging ways possible. These weren't just punishments, they were performance art pieces designed to send a message to anyone thinking about stepping out of line. The medieval justice system was basically one big psychological warfare campaign against potential criminals, and boy did they commit to the bit. From the moment you committed a crime to the moment you were finally released, if you survived, every single aspect of your punishment was carefully crafted to maximize not just your suffering, but the entertainment value for everyone watching. Because let's be honest, medieval people didn't have Netflix, so public executions and creative punishments were basically their primetime television. They would bring their entire families, pack lunches, and make it a whole day out. Kids would grow up thinking that watching someone get tortured in increasingly elaborate ways was just normal Sunday family fun. And the most disturbing part? Some of these punishment methods were so effective at deterring crime and entertaining the masses that they stuck around for hundreds of years, with some variations lasting well into the 18th and even 19th centuries. We're about to take a journey through time to explore these methods that range from mildly humiliating to absolutely horrifying, and trust me, by the end of this video, you'll be thanking your lucky stars that the worst thing that can happen to you for most crimes today is paying a fine or spending some time in a cell with cable television. To understand why medieval punishments were so absolutely bonkers, we need to step into the minds of people living between the 12th and 15th centuries, and trust me, it's a wild place to visit. Medieval society operated on a completely different logic than ours. Imagine a world where most people couldn't read, scientific method was basically non-existent, and your average person genuinely believed that God was personally involved in every single aspect of daily life, including whether or not you were guilty of stealing that chicken. The medieval justice system wasn't designed around the concept of rehabilitation or even deterrence in the way we understand it today. It was built on three main pillars: divine judgment, public spectacle, and social control. First, let's talk about divine judgment, because medieval people genuinely believed that God would intervene in human affairs to reveal the truth. This wasn't just a religious belief, it was literally built into their legal system. They had this wild concept called trial by ordeal, where they would basically torture you and see if God saved you, and if you survived, congratulations, you were innocent. If you died, well, obviously you were guilty and God decided you deserved it. This logic seems absolutely insane to us now, but to medieval people, it made perfect sense because they lived in a world where everything that happened was seen as part of God's plan. The second pillar was public spectacle, and this is where things get really interesting from a sociological perspective. Medieval towns were small, tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, and public punishment served as both entertainment and education. Remember, these people didn't have movies, television, books, or really any form of mass entertainment, so when someone got publicly punished, it was literally the most exciting thing that would happen that week. Entire families would show up, vendors would sell food, and it would turn into a festival atmosphere. The more elaborate and creative the punishment, the better the show, which naturally led to an arms race of increasingly bizarre punishment methods. The third pillar was social control, and this is probably the most important one to understand. Medieval society was incredibly rigid and hierarchical. You had kings, nobles, clergy, merchants, craftsmen, peasants, and serfs, all in very specific social layers, and the entire system depended on everyone staying in their lane. Public punishments weren't just about punishing the individual criminal, they were about reinforcing the social order and reminding everyone exactly what would happen if they stepped out of line. The more public and humiliating the punishment, the more effective it was at keeping people in check. But here's where it gets really twisted. Medieval people also had this concept of proportional punishment that seems completely backwards to us. They genuinely believed that the punishment should fit not just the crime, but also the social status of both the criminal and the victim. So if a peasant stole from a noble, that was considered a much worse crime than if a peasant stole from another peasant, and the punishment would be adjusted accordingly. This created a system where justice wasn't blind at all, it was hyper-aware of social status and designed to reinforce existing power structures. The legal process itself was also completely different from what we know today. There were no professional lawyers for most people, no standardized legal procedures, and definitely no concept of innocent until proven guilty. Most legal decisions were made by local lords or church officials who had zero legal training and were basically making it up as they went along. Evidence was often based on testimony from neighbors, which meant that being unpopular in your community could literally get you tortured or killed. And here's the kicker, many of these punishment methods were actually considered progressive improvements over older systems of justice that relied heavily on blood feuds and private revenge. Medieval authorities genuinely thought they were being more civilized by creating standardized, public punishments instead of just letting families fight it out. The irony is that in trying to create a more civilized system of justice, they ended up creating some of the most creative and brutal punishment methods in human history, and they were so proud of these innovations that they documented them extensively, which is how we know so much about them today. Now let's talk about just how absolutely bizarre medieval entertainment culture was, because when I say that public executions were the Netflix of the Middle Ages, I'm not exaggerating, I'm actually underselling it. Medieval people had turned watching other humans suffer into a legitimate social event that was more popular than modern sports, and the enthusiasm they brought to these gatherings would make modern football fans look calm and collected. Picture this, it's execution day in medieval London, and families are waking up early, packing picnic baskets, and getting their kids dressed in their Sunday best because they're all going to watch someone get their head chopped off, and this is considered normal family bonding time. The whole thing was so popular that vendors would set up food stalls around execution sites, selling everything from meat pies to ale, because nothing says family fun like eating lunch while watching someone die in the most elaborate way possible. But here's where it gets really twisted. Different types of executions attracted different crowds, almost like medieval people had developed their own genre preferences. A simple beheading was considered a bit boring, sort of like a romantic comedy, fine for a quiet afternoon, but not really worth traveling for. But a good drawing and quartering? That was like the medieval equivalent of a Marvel movie. People would travel from neighboring towns, book accommodations, and make it a whole weekend event. The really popular executions would draw crowds of thousands, and local authorities quickly realized they could make serious money off this morbid tourism by charging admission fees, selling souvenirs, and even auctioning off pieces of the execution equipment afterward. And we're not talking about people just showing up and grimly witnessing justice being served. These crowds were enthusiastic participants who would cheer, jeer, throw things, and sometimes even rush the stage to get a better look or grab a souvenir. Medieval execution crowds had the energy of a rock concert combined with the bloodthirst of a gladiator arena, and the condemned person was simultaneously the main performer and the least willing participant in the whole spectacle. The really disturbing part is how normalized this became across all levels of society. Kings and nobles would have private viewing areas built specifically for watching executions, complete with comfortable seating and refreshment services, because apparently watching people die was so entertaining that they needed to make sure they could do it in style. Church officials would give special sermons before big executions, framing the whole event as a moral lesson about the consequences of sin, which somehow made everyone feel better about enjoying the show. Even children were not just allowed but encouraged to attend these events because medieval parents genuinely believed that watching criminals get brutally punished would teach their kids important lessons about right and wrong. Imagine trying to explain to a modern parent that you're taking little Timmy to watch someone get slowly tortured to death because it's educational. But the cultural weirdness doesn't stop there. Medieval people also developed elaborate social rituals around executions that would make modern tailgating look sophisticated. There were traditional songs that crowds would sing, specific foods that were associated with different types of executions, and even fashion trends that emerged around execution attendance. Some people would dress up in their finest clothes because executions were serious social events where you wanted to be seen and make a good impression on your neighbors. Others developed a whole subculture around execution fandom, becoming regular attendees who would critique the executioner's technique, compare different punishment methods, and develop reputations as execution connoisseurs. These people would travel from town to town following the execution circuit like medieval deadheads, and they were treated with a weird kind of respect for their expertise in witnessing human suffering. The most mind-blowing aspect of this whole cultural phenomenon is that medieval people genuinely saw nothing wrong with any of it. This wasn't considered barbaric or unusual, it was just Tuesday. They had successfully created a society where the public torture and execution of human beings was not just accepted but celebrated, and they did it so effectively that this culture persisted for centuries without anyone seriously questioning whether maybe, just maybe, there might be something a little bit wrong with turning human suffering into mass entertainment. The fact that entire generations grew up thinking this was completely normal behavior really makes you wonder what cultural practices we have today that future historians are going to look back on with the same kind of horrified fascination. Let's start our journey into medieval punishment creativity with what they considered a light sentence, the stocks, and trust me, the fact that this was considered merciful really sets the tone for everything else we're going to cover today. The stocks were basically medieval society's answer to the question, how can we humiliate someone while making them as physically uncomfortable as possible without actually killing them? And the answer they came up with was surprisingly effective at achieving both goals. Picture a wooden contraption that looks like it was designed by someone who really understood the art of making people miserable. Two heavy wooden boards with holes cut out for your ankles, sometimes your wrists too, that would clamp shut and lock you in place in the most awkward, uncomfortable position imaginable. Now, you might think, okay, so you just sit there for a few hours, how bad could it be? And that's exactly the kind of modern thinking that would get you laughed out of a medieval courtroom, because medieval people understood that true punishment isn't just about physical discomfort, it's about psychological warfare. The stocks were typically placed in the busiest part of town, right in the market square where absolutely everyone would have to walk by and see you in your moment of maximum humiliation, and medieval people took full advantage of this captive audience situation. The whole point wasn't just that you couldn't move, it was that you couldn't move while everyone you knew walked by and got to see you at your absolute lowest point. And because medieval towns were small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, this meant that your punishment became the talk of the town for months afterward. But the real genius of the stocks wasn't the physical restraint, it was the fact that they turned every passerby into a potential participant in your punishment. Medieval people had developed a whole culture around tormenting people in the stocks, and it was considered not just acceptable but practically a civic duty to make the experience as miserable as possible for whoever was locked up. People would throw rotten vegetables, spoiled eggs, animal waste, and basically anything disgusting they could get their hands on, turning the stocks into a medieval version of a shooting gallery where you were the target and couldn't duck. The smell alone was apparently so horrific that people who survived a day in the stocks would often say that the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the sensory assault of being covered in rotting organic matter while breathing through your mouth to avoid the stench. And here's where medieval justice gets really creative. Different crimes would get you different stock experiences, because medieval authorities understood that one size definitely does not fit all when it comes to public humiliation. Petty thieves might get a standard ankle-only stock experience, while people convicted of more serious crimes like adultery or blasphemy would get the deluxe package with both hands and feet locked in, sometimes for multiple days, sometimes with special signs hung around their necks advertising exactly what they had done wrong so that passers-by would know exactly how to tailor their abuse. The stocks were also used as a kind of medieval social media platform for public shaming, because people would often carve or write messages on the wooden boards, creating a permanent record of community disapproval that would outlast the actual punishment. Some stocks from this period have been found with hundreds of carved insults, threats, and moral lessons, turning them into bizarre historical documents that capture the collective anger and creativity of medieval communities. The most disturbing part about the stocks is how effective they were at deterring crime, not because people were afraid of the physical discomfort, but because the social shame was so intense and long-lasting that it could destroy someone's reputation and livelihood permanently. In a society where your reputation was literally everything, where it determined whether you could get work, find a marriage partner, or even be served at local businesses, spending time in the stocks could be a life-ruining experience that followed you forever. And this was considered the gentle option, the humanitarian alternative to more severe punishments, which really makes you appreciate just how creative medieval people were going to get when they decided that someone deserved something worse than public humiliation and vegetable throwing. The stocks were basically medieval society's way of saying we could kill you, but instead we're going to let the entire community express their disappointment in you while you sit there and take it, and somehow this seemed like the more civilized approach. If you thought the stocks were bad, medieval lawmakers looked at that system and said, you know what, we can make this way worse, and invented the pillory, which was basically the stock's taller, meaner, more psychologically traumatic older brother that took everything terrible about public humiliation and turned it up to 11. The pillory was a wooden post with a hinged board at the top that had holes cut out for your head and both hands, which meant that instead of sitting in uncomfortable shame, you got to stand in uncomfortable shame while your head was literally locked in place, so you couldn't even look away from the crowd of people who were about to spend the next several hours making your life absolutely miserable. Now, the key difference between the stocks and the pillory wasn't just the standing versus sitting, it was the fact that the pillory put your head at the perfect height for maximum crowd interaction, and medieval people understood exactly what this meant and took full advantage of the improved targeting opportunities. With your head locked in place and your hands immobilized, you became the perfect stationary target for whatever the crowd felt like throwing, and because your face was now at chest level for most adults, people could get much more personal and creative with their abuse. The psychological impact of the pillory was also significantly worse than the stocks, because when you're sitting down, you can at least maintain some semblance of dignity, but when you're standing with your head sticking through a wooden board like some kind of medieval photo booth prop, there's really no way to make that look anything other than completely ridiculous. Medieval communities understood this and developed elaborate rituals around pillory punishment that turned the whole experience into community theater, where the person in the pillory was simultaneously the star, the villain, and the unwilling comedy relief. The pillory was particularly popular for punishments related to dishonesty or fraud, because medieval people had this poetic sense of justice that demanded that people who had deceived others should be displayed in a way that made their shame as visible as possible. Merchants who cheated customers, witnesses who lied in court, or anyone caught spreading false rumors would find themselves locked in the pillory with detailed signs explaining exactly what they had done, turning their punishment into a kind of medieval Yelp review that the entire town could read while they threw garbage at the offender's face. But here's where the pillory gets really creative. Because your hands were locked in place alongside your head, medieval communities developed a whole culture around decorating pilloried criminals with various humiliating accessories. People would hang signs, attach objects, or even tie things to the person's clothing, turning them into a kind of living billboard for community disapproval. Some communities would place mirrors in front of the pillory so that the punished person would have to stare at their own humiliation, which is the kind of psychological torture that would make modern prison reformers write very strongly worded letters. The physical discomfort of the pillory was also significantly worse than the stocks, because standing in the same position for hours while your neck and wrists are locked in place creates a special kind of agony that combines muscle fatigue, joint pain, and circulation problems into one comprehensive torture experience. People who spent full days in the pillory often reported that the physical pain was so intense that they actually welcomed the distraction of being pelted with rotten food, because it gave them something else to focus on besides their body slowly betraying them. The most disturbing aspect of the pillory was how it transformed normal, decent people into a mob of enthusiastic tormentors who would compete to see who could come up with the most creative ways to make the pilloried person suffer. Medieval records describe people bringing specially prepared concoctions of the most disgusting substances they could find, organizing group chants and songs designed to maximize psychological damage, and even developing games and contests around pillory abuse that turned human suffering into competitive entertainment. And just like the stocks, the pillory was considered a merciful alternative to more severe punishments, which really makes you wonder what medieval people considered unmerciful, because spending 8 hours standing with your head locked in a wooden frame while an entire community takes turns expressing their creativity through organized abuse seems pretty unmerciful from our perspective, but to medieval people, this was just Tuesday's entertainment with a side of moral education. Now we're entering the realm of punishments that were specifically designed with medieval society's absolutely charming views on women in mind, and let me introduce you to the ducking stool, which was basically medieval people saying, you know what really bothers us? Women who talk too much and then engineering a solution that involved nearly drowning them while the whole town watched and cheered. The ducking stool was a chair attached to a long wooden beam that worked like a seesaw, positioned next to a river, pond, or specially constructed water tank, and its primary purpose was to repeatedly dunk women into the water until they either learned their lesson or everyone got bored watching. This contraption was specifically reserved for what medieval authorities called scolds, which was their delightfully sexist term for women who were considered too outspoken, argumentative, or just generally insufficiently submissive for medieval tastes. The criteria for being labeled a scold was hilariously broad and basically included any woman who dared to express an opinion, argue with her husband, gossip too much, or commit the apparently heinous crime of being louder than medieval men thought was appropriate for someone with ovaries. The whole process was designed to be as humiliating as possible, because medieval people understood that the real punishment wasn't the physical discomfort of being dunked in cold, dirty water, it was the psychological trauma of being publicly identified as a woman who didn't know her place and then being literally put in her place by community-sanctioned drowning. They would strap the woman into the chair, usually after parading her through town so everyone knew what was happening, and then position her over the water while the crowd gathered for what was essentially medieval society's version of a gender-specific reality show. The operator of the ducking stool had complete control over how long and how deep each dunk would be, which meant that the punishment could range from a mild dunking that was mostly just wet and embarrassing to a nearly fatal drowning experience, depending on how much the community disapproved of the particular woman's behavior. The most twisted part was that the crowd would often cheer and shout suggestions about how long to keep her under, turning the whole thing into a participatory sport where everyone got to contribute to determining just how close to death this woman should be brought for the crime of having opinions. Medieval records show that ducking stools were incredibly popular community events that drew larger crowds than most other punishments, which really says something disturbing about medieval priorities when you consider that they found female punishment more entertaining than general criminal punishment. The authorities loved the ducking stool because it served multiple purposes. It punished the individual woman, entertained the community, and sent a clear message to all other women about what would happen if they stepped out of line. It was like a public service announcement about gender roles, except the announcement involved potential drowning and was considered family-friendly entertainment. The technical specifications of ducking stools also reveal just how much thought medieval people put into perfecting the art of female punishment. Different regions developed different designs, some with elaborate pulley systems for more precise control, others with specially designed chairs that would hold women in the most uncomfortable and undignified positions possible. Some ducking stools were even decorated with carvings and paintings that depicted previous victims or moral lessons about the importance of female silence, turning the punishment device itself into a work of misogynistic art. The really disturbing part is that ducking stools weren't just used for minor social infractions, they were also used for women accused of more serious crimes like witchcraft or adultery, where the ducking would be repeated until the woman either confessed, died, or somehow proved her innocence through survival. This created a system where being a woman who spoke up about anything could potentially escalate into a life-threatening situation, depending on how much the local community disliked you and whether they decided your talking constituted evidence of more serious moral failings. And here's the kicker: ducking stools were considered such an effective and appropriate punishment for women that they remained in use well into the 17th and 18th centuries, long after many other medieval punishments had been abandoned, because apparently the idea that women should be nearly drowned for talking too much was so appealing to patriarchal societies that they just couldn't let it go, even as they modernized everything else about their justice systems. Just when you think medieval society couldn't get more creative with their anti-woman punishment methods, they looked at the ducking stool and said, you know what, drowning women is effective, but what if we could just prevent them from talking in the first place? And thus was born the scold's bridle, which was basically a medieval iron face mask specifically designed to turn women into silent, terrified mannequins while simultaneously advertising to everyone in town that this particular woman had committed the unforgivable sin of using her mouth for something other than agreeing with men. The scold's bridle, also charmingly known as the gossip bridle or witch's bridle, was a metal contraption that looked like it was designed by someone who had very strong opinions about women's voices and access to a blacksmith who shared those opinions. The device consisted of an iron framework that caged the entire head, with a special metal piece called a bit that would be inserted into the woman's mouth and pressed down on her tongue, making speech not just difficult but agonizingly painful, because medieval people understood that if you really want to shut someone up, you need to make sure that even attempting to speak becomes a form of self-torture. The psychological impact of the scold's bridle was absolutely devastating because it transformed women into walking advertisements for female submission. Imagine trying to go about your daily life while wearing a metal cage on your head that announces to everyone you encounter that you've been officially declared too moody for society's comfort. Women wearing scold's bridles were often paraded through town before being secured to a public post or forced to sit in the marketplace, creating a spectacle that served as both punishment for the individual and warning for every other woman who might be thinking about expressing an opinion. The design variations of scold's bridles reveal just how much creative energy medieval craftsmen put into perfecting the art of female silencing, with some versions featuring spikes that would pierce the tongue if the woman attempted to speak, others with bells attached so that any head movement would create noise and draw attention to the wearer's shame, and some with elaborate decorative elements that turned the punishment device into a grotesque piece of wearable art. The most sadistic versions included what were called branks, which had sharp metal projections that would cut the inside of the mouth if the woman tried to move her tongue, creating a situation where the natural instinct to swallow saliva or even breathe through the mouth could result in self-inflicted wounds. Medieval authorities were so proud of these innovations that they would often commission specially decorated scold's bridles for repeat offenders, with engravings, artistic metalwork, and even personalized inscriptions that detailed the specific crimes of excessive talking or gossiping that had earned the woman this particular fashion accessory. The duration of scold's bridle punishment varied widely, from a few hours of public display to several days of continuous wear, and during this time the woman would be unable to eat, drink properly, or communicate her needs, which meant that what started as punishment for talking too much could easily escalate into life-threatening dehydration and malnutrition. The community aspect of Scold's bridal punishment was particularly cruel because it turned every interaction into an opportunity for further humiliation. Children would mock the silenced women, adults would lecture them about proper feminine behavior, and even other women would often participate in the shaming, either out of genuine disapproval or fear that showing sympathy might result in them being fitted for their own iron mask. The legal justifications for Scold's bridal use were absurdly broad and basically gave authorities permission to silence any woman who annoyed them, with official records listing crimes like disturbing the peace with her tongue, speaking against her betters, and the delightfully vague conduct unbecoming to her sex, which could apparently mean anything from arguing with merchants to expressing religious opinions. The most disturbing aspect of the Scold's bridal was how it represented the ultimate intersection of medieval society's fear of female autonomy and their love of creative punishment technology, creating a device that was simultaneously a torture instrument, a social control mechanism, and a piece of performance art designed to reinforce gender hierarchies through the literal silencing of women's voices. And the fact that these devices were used regularly for centuries suggests that medieval people found the concept of forcibly silencing women so appealing that they were willing to invest significant time, money, and craftsmanship into perfecting the technology. Now we're moving into the realm of punishments that weren't officially sanctioned by authorities but were so popular with medieval communities that they became their own form of grassroots justice. And let me introduce you to rough music, which was basically what happened when an entire town decided that someone needed to be taught a lesson and they were all going to participate in the teaching, whether the authorities liked it or not. Rough music was the medieval equivalent of going viral on social media, except instead of angry comments and quote tweets, you got the entire community showing up at your house with pots, pans, and whatever noise-making devices they could find, ready to make your life absolutely miserable until you either changed your behavior or moved to a different town. This wasn't just random mob harassment. Rough music was a highly organized, ritualized form of community punishment that followed specific rules and traditions that had been passed down for generations, creating a system where ordinary people could band together to enforce social norms without waiting for official authorities to get involved. The typical rough music event would start with someone in the community deciding that a particular person had violated social expectations in a way that demanded collective response, and the criteria for this was hilariously broad and included everything from adultery and domestic abuse to being a bad neighbor or charging too much for bread. Once the community consensus was reached that rough music was warranted, the whole thing would unfold like a carefully choreographed performance that combined elements of street theater, psychological warfare, and medieval flash mob culture. The participants would gather at a predetermined time, usually at night for maximum dramatic effect, armed with anything that could make noise: pots, pans, bells, horns, wooden spoons, and sometimes even improvised instruments specifically crafted for maximum annoyance potential. They would then march to the target's house in a procession that was designed to wake up the entire neighborhood and attract as much attention as possible, because the whole point was to make sure everyone knew exactly who was being shamed and why. Once they arrived at the target's residence, the real show would begin, with participants creating the most ungodly cacophony imaginable while chanting rhymes, songs, and insults that had often been composed specifically for the occasion and would detail exactly what the person had done wrong and what the community thought should happen to them. The noise alone was apparently so intense and sustained that it could be heard for miles, serving as a kind of medieval broadcasting system that announced to neighboring communities that someone was receiving the rough music treatment. But the genius of rough music wasn't just the noise, it was the way it combined auditory assault with visual spectacle and psychological pressure to create a multi-sensory punishment experience that could go on for hours or even days. participants would often bring effigies of the targeted person that they would burn, hang, or otherwise destroy in symbolic reenactments of what they wished they could do to the actual person, and sometimes they would create elaborate mock trials or ceremonies that turned the whole event into a kind of community theater production where everyone got to play a role in the collective expression of disapproval. The targets of rough music often reported that the psychological impact was devastating because it wasn't just one or two people expressing disapproval, it was literally everyone they knew and lived with, making it clear that they had been collectively rejected by their entire social world. The persistence of rough music participants was legendary, with some communities maintaining their noise-making vigil for days or even weeks until the target either publicly apologized, changed their behavior, or simply left town permanently, because medieval people understood that social pressure could be just as effective as physical punishment if you applied it with enough creativity and community coordination. The most disturbing aspect of rough music was how it demonstrated that medieval communities were perfectly capable of organizing sophisticated collective punishment campaigns without any official authority or legal framework, suggesting that the human capacity for creative group harassment is apparently universal and doesn't require institutional support to flourish. And here's the really wild part: rough music was so effective at enforcing social norms and so popular with communities that variations of it persisted well into the modern era, with documented cases occurring as late as the 20th century, proving that the appeal of community-organized public shaming is apparently timeless and transcends specific historical periods. Just when you think we've covered the extent of medieval creativity in the punishment department, we need to talk about what happened when medieval authorities looked at their justice system and decided, you know what this needs? More sword fighting, and thus was born trial by combat, which was basically medieval people saying, we can't figure out who's guilty, so let's make them fight to the death and let God sort it out. Because apparently divine intervention through organized violence seemed like a perfectly reasonable way to determine legal guilt. Trial by combat wasn't just some barbaric free-for-all, it was a highly regulated, legally sanctioned system where disputes could be settled through single combat, and both the church and secular authorities endorsed this as a legitimate method of discovering truth, operating under the assumption that God would ensure that the innocent party would win the fight, which is the kind of logic that would make modern lawyers question their career choices. The system worked like this: when two parties had a dispute that couldn't be resolved through normal legal proceedings, either party could invoke their right to trial by combat, and then they would literally fight each other, usually to the death, with the survivor being declared legally correct in the dispute, regardless of what the actual evidence might have suggested. This wasn't limited to minor disputes either. People used trial by combat to settle everything from property disputes and inheritance claims to accusations of treason and murder, creating a justice system where your ability to swing a sword was more legally relevant than your ability to present evidence or logical arguments. The really wild part is that medieval people genuinely believed this system was more reliable than traditional evidence-based trials, because they figured that human witnesses could lie and documents could be forged, but God would never let an innocent person lose a fight, which created a legal framework where might literally made right and physical prowess became the ultimate form of legal authority. But here's where it gets even more bizarre. The combat system had elaborate rules and procedures that made it almost like medieval mixed martial arts with life or death stakes. Fighters had to use specific weapons, follow certain protocols, and the whole thing was overseen by official judges who would make sure the combat was conducted fairly, because apparently if you're going to determine legal guilt through mortal combat, you need to make sure the mortal combat is properly regulated. The church was heavily involved in trial by combat, with priests blessing the weapons, offering prayers for divine guidance, and sometimes even participating in the pre-fight ceremonies, which really says something about medieval Christianity's relationship with violence when clergy members were actively supporting a system that involved people trying to kill each other for legal purposes. Different social classes had different rules for trial by combat, because of course they did, with nobles getting to fight with swords while peasants had to use clubs or other less prestigious weapons, and women could participate either by fighting themselves or by appointing male champions to fight on their behalf, creating a system where you could literally hire professional fighters to handle your legal problems through violence. The psychological pressure of trial by combat must have been absolutely intense, because you weren't just fighting for your life, you were fighting to prove your legal and moral righteousness in front of your entire community, with the added pressure of knowing that losing meant not just death but also eternal damnation, since defeat was interpreted as proof of guilt and therefore evidence that God had judged your soul and found it wanting. Medieval records show that trial by combat was incredibly popular and was used to settle disputes that ranged from the trivial to the monumentally important, with some cases involving entire armies fighting on behalf of different claimants, essentially turning legal disputes into small wars where the outcome would determine not just individual guilt or innocence but sometimes the fate of entire kingdoms. The most disturbing aspect of trial by combat was how it institutionalized the idea that justice could be achieved through violence and that physical strength was a more reliable indicator of moral truth than evidence or reasoning, creating a legal system that essentially guaranteed that the strongest and most skilled fighters would always be declared innocent while weaker individuals would be condemned regardless of the actual facts of their cases, and the fact that this system persisted for centuries and was considered a progressive improvement over other forms of medieval justice really makes you appreciate how far human civilization has come in terms of understanding the relationship between might and right. If trial by combat wasn't weird enough for you, medieval people also developed an entire category of legal proceedings called trial by ordeal, which was basically their way of saying, well, we're going to torture you in very specific ways and see if God saves you, and if you survive without permanent damage, congratulations, you're innocent. This system operated on the mind-bending logic that the creator of the universe was personally invested in medieval legal proceedings and would perform miracles on demand to prevent innocent people from being harmed by elaborate torture tests, which is the kind of faith-based justice system that would make modern civil rights lawyers have nervous breakdowns. The basic premise was that human judges might be corrupt or incompetent, but God was the ultimate judge who would never allow an innocent person to be harmed during these divinely supervised torture sessions, so they developed a whole menu of different ordeal options that ranged from merely terrifying to absolutely horrifying, all designed to put the accused in situations where only divine intervention could save them from serious injury or death. The most popular ordeal was the trial by hot iron, where the accused person would have to carry a red-hot iron bar for a specific distance, usually 9 feet, and then their hands would be bandaged and sealed for 3 days, after which the bandages would be removed and examined by authorities who would look for signs of healing that would indicate God's protection of the innocent. Because apparently medieval people believed that divine favor could be measured by burn recovery rates. The trial by boiling water was another crowd favorite, where the accused would have to retrieve a stone or ring from a pot of boiling water, with the depth depending on the severity of the accusation, wrist deep for minor crimes, elbow deep for major ones, and then the same 3-day bandaging and examination process would determine whether God had miraculously prevented the boiling water from causing serious burns. For people accused of adultery or other sexual crimes, there was the delightfully specific trial by cold water, where the accused would be bound and lowered into a body of water, and if they floated, it meant the pure water was rejecting their sinful body, proving guilt, but if they sank, it meant they were innocent, which created the perfect lose-lose situation where surviving meant you were guilty and drowning meant you were innocent but also dead. Medieval communities took these ordeals incredibly seriously and developed elaborate rituals around them that involved fasting, prayer, church ceremonies, and community gathering, turning the whole thing into a religious festival where torture was the main event and everyone genuinely believed they were witnessing divine judgment in action. The psychological impact on the accused must have been absolutely devastating because they weren't just facing physical torture, they were facing what their entire community believed was a direct test of their moral worth conducted by God Himself, which means that even if you survived the ordeal, you still had to live with the knowledge that everyone around you had just watched you get tortured as a way of determining whether you deserved to exist. The church was heavily involved in administering trials by ordeal, with priests conducting special masses, blessing the instruments of torture, and overseeing the entire process to ensure that proper religious protocols were followed, because apparently when you're going to let God decide someone's guilt through controlled torture, you want to make sure you're doing the torture correctly according to church standards. Different regions developed their own specialized ordeal variations, with some communities preferring trials by fire, others by water, and some getting creative with things like trial by poison, where the accused would consume potentially lethal substances and their survival or death would indicate divine judgment, creating a system where people could literally be sentenced to play Russian roulette with medieval toxins as a form of legal proceeding. The most disturbing aspect of trial by ordeal was how it represented the ultimate fusion of religious faith, legal authority, and sadistic creativity, creating a system where communities could torture people with complete moral certainty that they were doing God's work. And the fact that these practices were considered scientifically reliable and morally superior to evidence-based trials really demonstrates just how far human reasoning can be distorted when you combine superstition, institutional authority, and the very human desire to find simple solutions to complex moral questions. Now let's dive deep into the most popular medieval torture trial combo, the ordeal by hot iron, which was basically medieval society's way of saying we've invented a foolproof method for determining guilt that combines metalworking, religious ceremony, and severe burns into one convenient legal package, and somehow they convinced themselves that this was more reliable than actually investigating crimes like reasonable people. The ordeal by hot iron was so popular that it became the gold standard of medieval justice, with elaborate protocols and procedures that were followed with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that you'd normally associate with surgical procedures, except instead of saving lives, they were systematically burning people's hands off in the name of divine truth-seeking. The process began with 3 days of preparation that involved fasting, prayer, and church attendance for the accused, because medieval people understood that if you're going to have God perform a miracle to save you from being horribly burned, you should probably get spiritually prepared for the occasion, and this waiting period also served to build community anticipation for the big event, since everyone in town would know that someone was about to undergo the hot iron test and would start making plans to attend. On the day of the ordeal, the accused person would attend a special mass where priests would bless the iron bar and pray for divine guidance, creating a religious ceremony around what was essentially a legalized torture session, and then the iron would be heated in a specially consecrated fire until it was literally red-hot and glowing, while the entire community gathered to witness what they genuinely believed would be a direct demonstration of God's judgment. The actual carrying of the hot iron was conducted with the kind of ceremonial precision that medieval people usually reserved for coronations or religious festivals, with the accused person required to pick up the glowing metal bar with their bare hands and carry it exactly 9 feet before dropping it. And those 9 feet must have felt like 9 miles when you're holding something that's hot enough to melt skin and knowing that your entire future depends on how well your hands heal over the next 3 days. The immediate aftermath was apparently horrific, with witnesses describing the smell of burning flesh, the sound of sizzling skin, and the screams of the accused. But medieval people genuinely believed that innocent people would be miraculously protected from serious injury, so when someone's hands were obviously severely burned, they would just assume that God was testing everyone's faith or that the person was clearly guilty and deserved the suffering. The 3-day waiting period between the ordeal and the examination was probably the most psychologically torturous part of the whole process, because the accused person would have to sit with their burned, bandaged hands, not knowing whether the healing process would be judged sufficient to prove their innocence or whether they would be declared guilty and face additional punishment on top of their already ruined hands. The examination process was conducted by religious authorities who would unwrap the bandages and look for signs of healing that would indicate divine protection. But the criteria for what constituted miraculous healing was conveniently vague and subjective, which meant that the same burn injuries could be interpreted as either proof of innocence or evidence of guilt depending on what the authorities wanted the outcome to be. Medieval records show that the vast majority of people who underwent the ordeal by hot iron were declared guilty based on their burn injuries, which really makes you wonder whether the whole system was just an elaborate way of torturing people while maintaining the pretense that God was making the legal decisions. Because apparently having your hands burned off by red-hot iron was such compelling evidence of guilt that very few people managed to heal well enough to convince the authorities of their innocence. The long-term consequences for survivors of the hot iron ordeal were devastating, with many people losing the use of their hands permanently and becoming unable to work or support themselves, which meant that even if you were declared innocent after the examination, you still faced a lifetime of disability as a result of your brush with medieval justice. And the community would forever remember you as someone who had been suspected of serious crimes and subjected to divine testing. Okay, hold on to your hats because we've reached the absolute pinnacle of medieval punishment creativity, and I need you to mentally prepare yourself for drawing and quartering, which was basically medieval authorities saying, you know what, all these other punishments are cute, but let's invent something so horrifically elaborate that people will still be talking about it centuries later and using it as the gold standard for things that prove humans are capable of absolute madness. Drawing and quartering wasn't just an execution method, it was a full theatrical production that combined elements of public entertainment, religious ceremony, psychological warfare, and anatomical demonstration into one comprehensive spectacle that was designed to be so traumatizing that witnesses would never forget it and would spend the rest of their lives telling other people about the most disturbing thing they'd ever seen. The process was so elaborate and ritualized that it required multiple days of preparation and involved dozens of participants, making it less like a simple execution and more like a community-wide collaborative art project where the art was human suffering and everyone got to contribute their own special touch to the final masterpiece of agony. The whole thing started with the convicted person being dragged through the streets on a wooden hurdle, which was basically a primitive sledge designed to maximize the bumpiness of the journey and ensure that the condemned arrived at their execution site already beaten up and humiliated, because medieval people understood that a proper drawing and quartering needed to begin with comprehensive physical and psychological preparation. Once they arrived at the execution site, usually a prominent public location that could accommodate the massive crowds that these events attracted, the real show would begin with the drawing part, which involved hanging the person until they were almost but not quite dead, because the whole point was to keep them conscious for as much of the following horror as possible. And medieval executioners had apparently perfected the art of calculated near-death experiences. After the near hanging came the disembowelment, where the executioner would cut open the still living person and remove their internal organs, often burning them in front of the victim's eyes while they were still conscious enough to watch their own body parts being destroyed, which is the kind of detail that makes you realize that medieval people had really put some serious thought into maximizing the psychological impact of their punishment methods. Then came the actual quartering, where the person would be beheaded and their body cut into 4 pieces, with each piece being sent to a different part of the kingdom to be displayed as a warning to potential criminals, turning the executed person into a kind of gruesome traveling exhibition that would continue educating the public about the consequences of serious crimes long after the actual execution was over. The crowds that gathered for drawing and quartering events were enormous, with people traveling from neighboring towns and cities to witness what was considered the ultimate expression of royal justice, and vendors would set up food stalls and souvenir stands around the execution site, creating a festival atmosphere around what was essentially the most brutal public murder that human creativity had yet devised. The psychological impact on witnesses was apparently so intense that many people would faint, vomit, or have what we would now recognize as traumatic stress reactions, but medieval people interpreted these responses as evidence that the punishment was working correctly and serving its intended purpose of deterring future crime through absolute terror. Kings and nobles would sometimes attend drawing and quartering events personally, not just to witness the execution but to make a public statement about the power of royal authority and the consequences of challenging it, turning the whole thing into a political theater where the message was, "This is what happens when you cross the crown, and we want everyone to see exactly how creative we can get with our revenge." The most disturbing aspect of drawing and quartering was how it represented the absolute peak of institutional sadism, where legitimate government authority was used to justify and organize public torture sessions that were specifically designed to be as psychologically traumatic as possible for both the victim and the witnesses. And the fact that this was considered not just acceptable but admirable by medieval standards really makes you appreciate how much human concepts of justice and proportionality have evolved over the centuries. And here's the really wild part: drawing and quartering was reserved for the most serious crimes like high treason, which means that medieval authorities genuinely believed that certain offenses against royal authority were so heinous that they justified this level of elaborate, ritualized torture murder, creating a justice system where the punishment was literally designed to be worse than anything the original crime could possibly have been. Now we need to talk about what happened when medieval torture enthusiasts looked at all the punishment methods we've covered so far and said these are all great for public spectacle, but what if we want to torture someone slowly and privately over the course of several days or weeks? And thus was born the Judas cradle, which was basically medieval people taking their torture technology to the next level by inventing a device that could cause excruciating pain without actually killing the victim, allowing for extended torture sessions that could go on for as long as the authorities felt like keeping someone alive and suffering. The Judas cradle was a pyramid-shaped wooden or metal seat that was specifically designed to be the most uncomfortable thing a human being could possibly sit on, with the victim being slowly lowered onto the pointed tip until it penetrated their body, and then left there for hours or days while gravity and their own body weight gradually increased the depth of the penetration and the intensity of the agony. This wasn't a quick execution device. It was a slow-motion torture machine that allowed medieval authorities to keep someone in constant, increasing pain for extended periods while still maintaining the pretense that they weren't technically executing the person, since death would come slowly through infection, blood loss, or sheer physical trauma rather than through immediate violence. The psychological torture aspect of the Judas cradle was arguably worse than the physical pain, because victims would be positioned so they could see exactly how the device worked and could anticipate the gradually increasing agony that awaited them, and medieval torturers understood that anticipation of pain could be just as effective as actual pain in breaking someone's will and extracting confessions. The device became popular throughout Europe during the Spanish Inquisition, where it was used extensively for extracting confessions from suspected heretics, and the Catholic Church officially endorsed its use as a tool for saving souls by encouraging sinners to confess their crimes and repent before dying, which is the kind of religious logic that would make modern theologians question their faith in human nature. The technical specifications of different Judas cradles reveal just how much engineering effort went into perfecting the art of prolonged torture, with some versions featuring adjustable heights, removable tips of different shapes and sizes, and even heating elements that could be used to make the metal tip red hot for extra sensory impact, because medieval people apparently believed that if you're going to torture someone, you might as well do it with style and technical precision. The Judas cradle was often used in combination with other torture methods, creating comprehensive torture programs where victims would be moved between different devices depending on their level of cooperation and the creativity of their torturers. And medieval torture chambers would sometimes feature entire collections of devices that could be used in sequence to create customized torture experiences tailored to specific crimes or personality types. The social context around Judas cradle use was particularly disturbing because it was primarily used in private settings by religious and secular authorities who wanted to extract information or confessions without the public spectacle aspect of other punishment methods, creating a parallel system of secret torture that operated alongside the public punishment system we've been discussing. The historical records of Judas cradle torture sessions are some of the most disturbing documents from the medieval period, with detailed descriptions of victims who were kept alive and suffering for weeks while being repeatedly questioned, tortured, allowed to heal slightly, and then tortured again, creating cycles of hope and despair that were specifically designed to break people psychologically as well as physically. The connection between the Judas cradle and other torture devices of the period reveals a disturbing pattern of innovation and refinement in torture technology, with medieval authorities treating the development of new and improved torture methods as a legitimate field of study that deserved the same kind of attention and resources that other societies might devote to art, literature, or scientific advancement. The most horrifying aspect of the Judas cradle was how it represented the industrialization of torture, with standardized designs, instruction manuals, and training programs for operators, creating a systematic approach to human suffering that treated torture as a professional skill that could be taught, learned, and perfected through practice and technical innovation. And the fact that devices like the Judas cradle were used continuously for centuries across multiple cultures and religious systems suggests that the human capacity for inflicting prolonged, calculated suffering on other humans is not limited to any particular historical period or cultural context but represents something much more disturbing about the darker aspects of human nature. All right, we've reached the absolute summit of medieval punishment insanity, and I need you to brace yourself for the breaking wheel, which was basically medieval society looking at all the horrific punishment methods they'd already invented and saying, "Hold my mead, I'm about to show you what happens when human creativity and sadistic ingenuity collide with absolutely no moral constraints whatsoever." Because the breaking wheel wasn't just an execution method, it was a masterclass in prolonged agony that combined engineering precision, anatomical knowledge, and psychological warfare into one device that was specifically designed to turn dying into the most drawn-out, agonizing experience humanly possible. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was a large wooden wheel, usually about 6 feet in diameter, onto which the condemned person would be tied with their limbs stretched out and secured to the spokes, creating a human display that was positioned for maximum visibility and accessibility for the executioner. who would then spend the next several hours systematically breaking every major bone in the victim's body using heavy hammers, iron bars, or specially designed bone breaking tools. This wasn't a quick smash-and-done situation. Medieval executioners had turned bone breaking into an art form that required skill, timing, and an almost surgical understanding of human anatomy to ensure that the victim remained conscious and aware throughout the entire process, because the whole point was to maximize suffering while prolonging life for as long as possible. The executioner would start with the limbs, methodically breaking the bones in the arms and legs in a specific sequence that would cause maximum pain without immediately killing the victim, and they had developed techniques for breaking bones in ways that would cause internal bleeding and organ damage while still keeping the person alive and conscious for hours or even days of additional agony. After all the major bones were broken, the victim would be left on the wheel to die slowly from their injuries, and medieval people understood that this process could take anywhere from a few hours to several days, depending on the skill of the executioner and the physical condition of the victim, creating a situation where dying became a prolonged public performance that entire communities would gather to witness. The psychological impact of the breaking wheel was absolutely devastating for both victims and witnesses, because the sound of breaking bones was apparently so disturbing and the sight of a person being systematically destroyed was so traumatic that many people would have nightmares and psychological problems for years afterward. But medieval authorities saw this as a feature, not a bug, since the whole point was to create a punishment so horrifying that the mere threat of it would prevent people from committing serious crimes. The wheel was typically positioned in a prominent public location where it could be seen from a distance, and the broken victim would be left displayed as a warning to others, creating a macabre public monument to the consequences of serious crime that would remain visible until the body decomposed completely or was eaten by birds and animals, which medieval people considered an appropriate final indignity for serious criminals. Different regions developed their own variations of the breaking wheel, with some featuring spikes or sharp edges that would add cutting and piercing wounds to the bone-breaking experience, others with mechanisms that could rotate the wheel to change the victim's position and create new opportunities for additional torture, and some with elaborate decorative elements that turned the execution device into a grotesque work of art that advertised the community's commitment to creative justice. The breaking wheel was reserved for the most serious crimes like murder, rape, arson, and high treason, but medieval records show that it was also sometimes used for lesser crimes when authorities wanted to make a particularly strong statement about law and order, creating a justice system where the punishment was often exponentially worse than the original crime and bore no relationship to any reasonable concept of proportionality. The most disturbing aspect of the breaking wheel was how it represented the ultimate expression of institutional sadism, where legitimate government and religious authority was used to justify and organize torture sessions that were specifically designed to be as traumatic and prolonged as possible. And the fact that entire communities would turn out to watch these events as entertainment really demonstrates just how far human moral standards can deteriorate when cruelty becomes normalized and institutionalized. The breaking wheel remained in use across Europe for centuries, with documented cases as late as the 18th century, proving that once humans invent a particularly effective method of inflicting suffering, they become remarkably reluctant to give it up, even as other aspects of society become more civilized and enlightened. After centuries of watching people get tortured, dismembered, and creatively destroyed in increasingly elaborate ways, you might think that medieval populations would eventually say, okay, maybe this is getting a bit out of hand, but instead, something far more disturbing happened. They became so completely desensitized to human suffering that extreme violence became as normal and unremarkable as medieval people watching the weather, and entire generations grew up thinking that public torture was just another part of daily life, like going to church or buying bread at the market. The psychological impact of constant exposure to institutionalized cruelty created a society where empathy for suffering became a rare commodity, and medieval people developed an almost casual attitude toward human pain that allowed them to watch someone get slowly tortured to death while eating lunch and discussing completely unrelated topics like crop yields or local gossip. Children who grew up attending public executions and torture sessions as family entertainment developed a fundamentally different relationship with violence and suffering than we can even comprehend today, and medieval records show that kids would often play games that involved reenacting the torture methods they had witnessed, creating a culture where simulated cruelty became a normal part of childhood development and social learning. The economic impact of the medieval torture entertainment industry was also significant, with entire professional classes emerging around the business of public suffering, including executioners who became celebrities, vendors who specialized in execution day food and souvenirs, and craftsmen who devoted their careers to designing and building increasingly sophisticated torture devices, creating a legitimate economy based on human misery that employed thousands of people and generated substantial tax revenue for medieval authorities. Medieval communities developed elaborate social hierarchies around execution attendance, with the best viewing spots being reserved for wealthy and important citizens while poor people had to watch from the back of the crowd, and some cities even built permanent grandstands and viewing platforms around execution sites, turning public torture into a kind of medieval stadium sport with season tickets and preferred seating arrangements. The normalization of extreme violence also had profound effects on medieval concepts of justice and morality, with people becoming so accustomed to disproportionate punishments that they lost the ability to distinguish between reasonable consequences and sadistic overkill, creating a society where stealing a loaf of bread could result in death and no one would question whether that seemed like an appropriate response to hunger-driven petty theft. Medieval literature and art from this period reflect this casual relationship with violence, with popular songs, stories, and visual art frequently depicting torture and execution scenes as entertainment rather than tragedy, and many medieval festivals and celebrations incorporated mock executions and simulated torture as standard entertainment elements, suggesting that the line between real and pretend violence had become thoroughly blurred in medieval popular culture. The religious community's response to the normalization of extreme punishment was particularly complex, with church authorities simultaneously condemning violence in principle while actively participating in and endorsing the torture-based justice system, creating a cognitive dissonance that medieval people resolved by developing elaborate theological justifications for why torturing people was actually a form of Christian charity that saved souls through suffering. The long-term psychological effects on medieval society were profound and lasting, with entire regions developing cultural identities that were built around their reputation for particularly creative or brutal punishment methods, and some cities became famous throughout Europe for their innovative approaches to public torture, creating a kind of medieval tourism industry where people would travel specifically to witness the local specialty execution techniques. As the medieval period progressed, communities began competing with each other to develop the most elaborate and entertaining punishment spectacles, leading to an arms race of creative cruelty where authorities would invest substantial resources in outdoing neighboring towns and cities, creating public works projects that were essentially monuments to institutionalized sadism. The most disturbing aspect of the population's final reaction to centuries of normalized torture was how completely it had redefined their understanding of what constituted normal human behavior, with medieval people genuinely believing that their torture-based entertainment culture represented the pinnacle of civilized society and that communities without elaborate public punishment spectacles were somehow primitive or underdeveloped, creating a worldview where the absence of institutionalized cruelty was seen as a sign of cultural inferiority rather than moral progress. Here's where this story gets really wild. You might think that all these medieval punishment methods eventually died out as humanity became more civilized and enlightened, but the truth is that many of these torture techniques had such staying power that they persisted well into the modern era, with some variations still being used as late as the 19th and even 20th centuries, proving that once humans invent a really effective way to make other humans suffer, they become remarkably reluctant to let go of it, even when everything else about society has supposedly evolved past medieval barbarity. The ducking stool, that delightful device for nearly drowning Maori women, was still being used in colonial America as late as the 1760s, and the last recorded ducking stool execution in England didn't happen until 1809. Which means that there were people alive during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson who were still being dunked to death for the crime of talking too much. And that really puts American concepts of justice and women's rights into a disturbing historical perspective. Stocks and pillories remained standard punishment methods in both Europe and America well into the 1800s, with many American towns maintaining public stocks in their town squares as late as the Civil War era, and some of these devices are still standing today as historical curiosities that tourists can take selfies with, which is probably not the legacy that medieval torture enthusiasts were hoping for when they invested so much creative energy into perfecting the art of public humiliation. The scold's bridle had an even more disturbing persistence, with variations being used in various forms through the 1800s and documented cases of similar devices being used for treating mental illness and unruly behavior in women well into the 20th century, suggesting that the fundamental concept of forcibly silencing women who didn't conform to social expectations remained appealing to patriarchal authorities for centuries after the official end of the medieval period. The legal principle of trial by ordeal officially disappeared from most European legal systems by the 13th century, but the underlying concept that guilt could be determined through physical testing persisted in various forms, including witch trials that used water ordeals and other physical tests to determine supernatural guilt, and modern polygraph tests and other scientific methods of guilt determination can trace their conceptual ancestry back to medieval people's belief that truth could be revealed through physical examination of the accused person's body and reactions. The breaking wheel remained in use in various European countries until the late 1700s, with the last documented breaking wheel execution occurring in Germany in 1841, which means that there were people alive during the California Gold Rush who were still being systematically bone-broken to death by their own governments. And that really makes you appreciate just how recent our modern concepts of humane punishment actually are in terms of human history. The psychological legacy of medieval punishment culture was equally persistent and arguably more damaging than the physical continuation of specific torture methods, because the normalization of extreme violence as entertainment and social control created cultural patterns that influenced European and American attitudes toward justice, discipline, and social control for centuries afterward, with public executions remaining popular entertainment in America until the 1930s and some states not abolishing public executions until the 1960s. Medieval torture devices became collector's items and museum pieces that were displayed with a weird combination of historical reverence and morbid fascination, creating an ongoing cultural relationship with torture technology that treated these devices as fascinating artifacts of human creativity rather than horrifying examples of institutional sadism. And many of these devices are still on display in museums around the world where tourists can admire the craftsmanship that went into perfecting the art of human suffering. The influence of medieval punishment culture can also be seen in colonial justice systems around the world. where European powers exported their torture-based legal traditions along with their political control, creating global networks of institutionalized cruelty that affected indigenous populations who were suddenly subjected to European concepts of justice that included creative torture methods their own cultures had never imagined. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the medieval punishment legacy is how it demonstrated that seemingly civilized, religious, and educated societies could not only tolerate but actively celebrate institutionalized torture and cruelty, providing a historical precedent that later authoritarian regimes would reference and build upon when developing their own systems of state-sponsored violence and social control, proving that the medieval period wasn't an aberration in human moral development, but rather a demonstration of capacities that remain present in human societies under the right conditions. So after taking this absolutely delightful journey through the greatest hits of medieval punishment creativity, I think we need to step back and appreciate just how far we've come as a species, because while we might complain about getting parking tickets or having to pay court fees, at least nobody is suggesting that we settle our disputes through mortal combat or determine guilt by seeing how well we heal from red-hot iron burns, which really puts modern justice system complaints into perspective and makes you grateful that the worst thing that can happen to you for most crimes today is losing some money or spending time in a room with cable television and 3 meals a day. The evolution from let's torture people creatively in public while everyone watches and cheers to let's put people in timeout rooms and maybe make them do community service represents one of the most dramatic improvements in human civilization, and it happened relatively recently in historical terms, which should probably make us both proud of our progress and terrified of how quickly societies can backslide into institutionalized cruelty when people stop paying attention to their moral standards. When you really think about it, medieval people weren't fundamentally different from us. They had the same basic human emotions, similar social structures, and comparable intelligence levels, but somehow they created a justice system that treated public torture as family entertainment, which suggests that the difference between civilized behavior and medieval-style cruelty isn't as large as we'd like to think and depends heavily on cultural norms, institutional checks and balances, and people actively choosing to maintain moral standards rather than sliding into the easier path of solving problems through violence. Modern people love to criticize our justice system for being too lenient or too harsh, but imagine if you had to explain to a medieval person that in our society, people who commit crimes usually get fair trials with professional lawyers, standardized legal procedures, and punishments that are specifically designed to be proportionate to their crimes rather than maximally entertaining for the general public. They would probably think we had gone completely soft and lost our understanding of proper deterrence through creative suffering. The fact that we've managed to create justice systems that prioritize rehabilitation over revenge, evidence over spectacle, and human dignity over public entertainment represents a genuine moral evolution that wasn't inevitable or automatic but required centuries of people making conscious choices to move away from the easy satisfactions of institutionalized cruelty toward more complex and challenging approaches to social problems. Of course, our modern justice system isn't perfect, and we still have plenty of issues with fairness, effectiveness, and proportionality, but when you compare contemporary prison conditions to being slowly crushed by a breaking wheel while your neighbors eat picnic lunches and cheer for your bones to snap louder, it really helps put our current problems into perspective and reminds us that imperfect justice is still infinitely better than entertainingly perfect torture. The medieval punishment system also teaches us something important about human psychology and social dynamics, specifically that normal, decent people can become enthusiastic participants in institutionalized cruelty remarkably quickly when that cruelty is presented as normal, necessary, and socially approved, which is a lesson that has disturbing relevance for understanding how authoritarian systems develop and maintain public support for policies that future generations will look back on with horror and disbelief. Another fascinating aspect of medieval punishment culture is how it reveals the human capacity for creative problem-solving applied to completely wrong objectives, because the people who invented the scold's bridle, the breaking wheel, and trial by ordeal were clearly intelligent and innovative individuals who put substantial thought and effort into perfecting their craft. They just happened to be applying their talents to making other humans suffer as efficiently as possible, which makes you wonder what amazing things they might have accomplished if they had directed that same creative energy toward literally any other goal. The transition from medieval to modern justice also shows how much our understanding of human psychology, social dynamics, and effective deterrence has evolved, because medieval people genuinely believed that making punishments as public, dramatic, and brutal as possible would prevent crime. But modern research suggests that certainty of punishment is much more effective than severity, and that public spectacle often backfires by making criminals into martyrs or heroes rather than cautionary. Examples. Perhaps the most important lesson from this whole medieval punishment adventure is that moral progress isn't automatic or permanent. It requires constant effort and vigilance from people who are willing to say maybe we shouldn't torture people for entertainment even when torture is popular, profitable, and institutionally supported. Because the capacity for creative cruelty is always there waiting for the right social conditions to bring it back. So what's the moral of this absolutely delightful story about human creativity applied to making other humans miserable in the most elaborate ways possible? Well, first and most obviously, we should probably all send thank you cards to whoever invented due process, because the fact that we live in a world where innocent until proven guilty is a thing and where legal guilt is determined by evidence rather than by seeing how well you heal from torture burns is apparently not something we should take for granted. Given that our ancestors spent several centuries thinking that the best way to determine truth was through creative violence and public entertainment spectacles. The second moral is that we should probably be a little more grateful for boring, bureaucratic, modern justice systems, because yes, dealing with court paperwork and legal fees is annoying and time-consuming, but it beats the medieval alternative of having your guilt determined by whether you float or sink when they throw you in a river, and honestly, even the most frustrating modern legal experience is still preferable to being strapped to a breaking wheel while your neighbors place bets on how long it will take for all your bones to snap. Another important lesson is that human beings have an apparently unlimited capacity for convincing themselves that horrible things are actually good things when those horrible things are socially approved and institutionally supported, because medieval people genuinely believed that their torture-based justice system was more moral, more effective, and more civilized than alternatives that didn't involve public bone-breaking and creative humiliation, which should make us all a little more skeptical of our own cultural assumptions about what constitutes acceptable treatment of other human beings. The story of medieval punishments also teaches us that the phrase, "this is how we've always done things," is usually a terrible justification for continuing bad practices, because medieval people used traditional authority to justify torture methods for centuries, and if someone had stood up in 1347 and said, "Hey, maybe we shouldn't determine legal guilt by seeing who survives being burned with hot iron," they would have been told that they were rejecting centuries of proven legal wisdom and probably needed some time in the stocks to think about their dangerous modern ideas. Perhaps most importantly, this whole medieval punishment adventure demonstrates that moral progress is possible but not automatic, and that the difference between living in a society where people get fair trials and living in a society where people get tortured for entertainment is usually just a few people in positions of authority making better choices about how to treat human beings. Which means that maintaining civilized society requires constant effort from people who are willing to say, maybe we can solve this problem without torturing anyone, even when torture is the traditional, popular, and profitable option. The medieval punishment story also reveals something fascinating about human nature, specifically that we seem to have an inexhaustible capacity for creative problem solving, but we're not always great at choosing the right problems to solve, because the people who invented the Judas cradle and perfected the art of public bone breaking were clearly intelligent and innovative. But they were applying their talents to making other people suffer rather than to making the world better, which makes you wonder what medieval society might have accomplished if they had directed all that creative energy toward medicine, architecture, or literally anything other than torture technology. And finally, the most entertaining moral of this story is that we should probably all be a little more patient with modern inconveniences like slow internet, delayed flights, and customer service hold times, because our ancestors thought that waiting 3 days to see if your hands healed properly after carrying red-hot iron was a reasonable timeline for determining legal guilt. So maybe we can handle waiting 20 minutes for tech support without having complete emotional meltdowns about the decline of modern civilization. The ultimate takeaway is that while human beings clearly have the capacity for incredible cruelty and creative sadism, we also have the capacity for moral improvement and can choose to build societies that prioritize human dignity over entertainment value, evidence over spectacle, and rehabilitation over revenge. And the fact that we've managed to move from medieval torture festivals to modern concepts of proportionate justice and humane treatment suggests that maybe, just maybe, we're capable of continuing to get better at being human beings, as long as we remember that moral progress requires constant effort and that the alternative to choosing compassion is usually some variation of strapping people to breaking wheels while everyone watches and cheers. Now, if you thought medieval people were creative when it came to punishing criminals, wait until you hear what they did when they were trying to help sick people, because apparently medieval medical professionals looked at their justice system's approach to creative human torture and said, hold our medical degrees, we're about to show you what happens when we apply that same innovative spirit to healthcare, and somehow managed to create a medical system that was arguably more dangerous than just leaving sick people alone and hoping for the best. I'm talking about medieval medicine, where doctors genuinely believed that the best way to treat a headache was to drill holes in your skull. The optimal response to mental illness was to chain people in dungeons and occasionally hose them down with cold water, and the standard cure for basically everything was to cut you open and drain out a significant portion of your blood, because they were convinced that most health problems were caused by having too much blood, which is the kind of medical logic that would make modern doctors question their career choices and possibly consider becoming medieval torture device historians instead. Medieval physicians had developed an entire medical philosophy based on the concept of humors, not the funny kind, but the bodily fluid kind, and they genuinely believed that all illness was caused by imbalances between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which led them to develop treatment methods that were specifically designed to rebalance these humors through techniques that included bloodletting, vomiting, diarrhea-inducing medications, and various forms of controlled poisoning. Because apparently medieval people thought that the best way to cure sick people was to make them sicker in very specific and systematic ways. The tools that medieval doctors used for their healing work looked suspiciously similar to torture devices, and in many cases they actually were torture devices that had been repurposed for medical use, because medieval people had apparently decided that the line between helping people and hurting people was more of a suggestion than a firm boundary, and they developed surgical procedures that involved saws, hammers, red-hot branding irons, and various sharp metal implements that were designed to cut, burn, or puncture human bodies in the name of medical treatment. Medieval dentistry was particularly horrifying and involved techniques like burning tooth nerves with hot metal, extracting teeth with pliers that looked like they belonged in a blacksmith's shop, and treating toothaches with remedies that included placing live worms in the mouth and using various toxic substances that would kill the tooth pain by essentially poisoning the entire nervous system. Because medieval dentists had apparently never heard of the concept that medical treatment should be less painful than the original problem. The anesthesia options available to medieval patients were limited to alcohol, opium if you were lucky enough to afford it, and occasionally being knocked unconscious with a wooden club, which meant that most medical procedures were performed on fully conscious patients who were simply held down by assistants while doctors did things to them that would be considered torture in any other context. And medieval medical records describe patients screaming, fainting, and sometimes dying from shock during routine procedures that modern medicine can perform painlessly in outpatient settings. But here's where it gets really wild. Medieval people also had some genuinely bizarre theories about what caused illness in the first place, including the belief that disease was caused by bad air, evil spirits, divine punishment for moral failings, or astrological influences, which led them to develop prevention and treatment methods that included wearing lucky charms, reciting magical incantations, timing medical procedures according to lunar phases, and practicing various forms of sympathetic magic that involved using animal parts, plant extracts, and human bodily fluids in combinations that defied any kind of logical explanation. The next video is going to explore the absolutely insane world of medieval healthcare, where we'll discover medical practices that make modern anti-vaxxers look like rational scientific thinkers, surgical procedures that had mortality rates higher than the diseases they were supposed to cure, and pharmaceutical treatments that were basically legalized poisoning programs administered by people with medical degrees who genuinely believed they were saving lives while systematically destroying their patients' health through creative applications of medieval medical science that somehow managed to be both completely wrong and surprisingly persistent in their wrongness. And that brings us to the end of our absolutely delightful journey through the creative highlights of medieval punishment technology, and I hope you've enjoyed learning about how our ancestors turned making people suffer into both an art form and a spectator sport, because honestly, after researching all of these torture methods, I have a whole new appreciation for modern problems like traffic tickets and jury duty, which suddenly seem like the most civilized and humane approaches to social organization that humanity has ever devised. If you made it through this entire video without questioning your faith in human nature or wondering how we managed to evolve past the point of thinking that public bone breaking was quality family entertainment, then congratulations, you have a stronger stomach for historical horror than most people. And you're probably ready for that upcoming medieval medicine video where we'll explore how doctors used to treat patients with techniques that were somehow worse than the torture methods we just spent 90 minutes discussing. Before you go, I need you to do me a favor and hit that like button if you enjoyed this deep dive into medieval madness, because apparently the YouTube algorithm thinks that videos about historical torture need more engagement than videos about cute cats, and honestly, I'm not sure what that says about modern society's entertainment preferences. But I'm hoping it means that people are genuinely interested in learning about how we got from let's determine guilt through creative violence to let's use evidence and proportionate punishment, rather than just enjoying the torture descriptions for their own sake. make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because we're going to continue exploring the weird, wonderful, and absolutely horrifying aspects of medieval life that somehow shaped the modern world we live in today. And trust me, every single aspect of medieval society was approximately as bizarre and disturbing as their approach to criminal justice. From their medical practices and religious beliefs to their hygiene habits and social customs, so there's plenty more historical nightmare fuel where this came from. Drop a comment below and let me know which of these medieval punishment methods you think was the most creative, the most horrifying, or the most difficult to believe actually happened, because I'm genuinely curious about which aspects of medieval cruelty people find most fascinating or disturbing. And also because YouTube's algorithm apparently thinks that videos with lots of comments are more worthy of being recommended to other people who might enjoy learning about historical torture methods. For educational purposes. If you're feeling particularly adventurous, share this video with friends and family members who might appreciate learning about the darker aspects of human history, but maybe give them a warning first, because this content is definitely not for everyone, and some people prefer their historical education to focus on things like art, architecture, and cultural achievements rather than on the creative ways that people used to torture each other for public entertainment. Also, check out our previous videos where we've explored other fascinating aspects of medieval life, including their approaches to hygiene, their beliefs about medicine and disease, and their absolutely insane theories about how the natural world worked, because medieval people were consistently wrong about almost everything in the most entertaining and educational ways possible. And understanding their mistakes helps us appreciate just how much human knowledge and social organization have improved over the centuries. And finally, if you're interested in diving even deeper into this topic, there are some amazing books and documentaries about medieval punishment methods, legal systems, and social organization that provide much more detail than we could possibly fit into a single video. And I'll include some recommendations in the description below for people who want to continue exploring this absolutely fascinating and disturbing aspect of human history that somehow managed to persist for centuries before people finally decided that maybe, just maybe, there were better ways to organize society than through institutionalized creative torture. Remember that understanding history, even the dark and disturbing parts, helps us make better choices about the kind of world we want to live in today, and the fact that we've managed to move from medieval torture festivals to modern concepts of human rights and proportionate justice should give us hope that humanity is capable of continued moral progress, as long as we remember the lessons of the past and stay committed to choosing compassion over cruelty, evidence over spectacle, and human dignity over entertainment value, because the alternative is always some variation of strapping people to breaking wheels while everyone watches and cheers.